I'm Nathan Cole from Fatal Files, and today we're looking at cases where Karen behavior didn't just ruin someone else's day, it ended in horrifying consequences. From a woman who refused to wear a seatbelt because it smelled dirty moments before being thrown through a windshield, to a homeowner so obsessed with spying on her neighbors that crawling beneath their deck exposed her to a fatal infection. It was July 22, 2018, on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio. An active construction site, kind of half-finished development you pass on the edge of town where the road turns to gravel and the streetlights stop. By late evening, the crew was long gone. The site was dark, uneven, and quiet. Temporary fencing ran the perimeter, and stacks of lumber sat staged across the ground in various states of organization, some banded, some not. Nobody was supposed to be there. Tara Schwab was 41 years old. She ran a resale side business, sourcing materials and salvageable goods and moving them through secondhand channels. She had been doing it long enough to develop a system, spot the material, assess the value, figure out how to get it. She had an eye for what could be flipped and strong opinions about what counted as waste versus what counted as property. To her, materials sitting unused on a job site were fair game. That belief had probably helped her find good deals over the years. On July 22nd, it put her on a site she had no right to enter, in the dark, alone. Earlier that same day, Tara had shown up during working hours and approached workers directly about a stack of lumber near the staging area. She believed it was scrap. She told them as much and said she had a right to take it. The workers were clear. The lumber was active material, still part of the project, and the site was off limits. Tara disagreed, pushed the point, and eventually left, but not before making it obvious she hadn't accepted their answer. She came back that night, not by accident. She had identified a gap in the temporary fencing earlier that day and returned to it after dark, specifically to take the lumber without anyone there to stop her. She knew exactly where the gap was and exactly which stack she wanted. She went directly to it. Most people, when they get told no, go home and move on. Tara went home and made a plan. That shift from frustration to logistics is the detail that changes what this is. It stops being a bad decision and starts being a chosen one. The site lighting was limited, a few distant work lamps that did more to create shadows than clear them. The ground was uneven the way construction sites always are mid-project, packed dirt and loose material with no level surface to stand on reliably. The lumber she wanted was stacked several layers high on that kind of ground without banding holding the load together. There was no one to ask for help if something went wrong. No one who even knew she was there. She began pulling boards from the middle of the stack, not from the top, not from the edges, but the middle, because that's where the pieces she wanted were. Getting to them faster meant not working down from the top, layer by layer. It was a practical choice that made sense if you weren't thinking about load distribution. As she pulled, the upper layers shifted. Investigators later concluded the load had shown signs of instability before the final collapse. She kept pulling. The balance failed. The stack came forward, dropping several hundred pounds of lumber onto her upper body. She went down and was pinned. Additional boards fell across her torso, compressing her chest enough to prevent her from breathing. She was face up in the dark on a site where no one would return until morning. There's a version of this where she sees the stack shift and steps back, where that first movement in the wood is enough. But she was there for a reason, in the dark, having already talked herself into it once. Stopping would have meant admitting the workers were right, and she had decided they weren't. Site crew found her the following morning during routine checks before the start of the workday. She was still beneath the lumber where she had fallen. Emergency responders were called and confirmed her death at the scene. Based on the state of the scene and the timeline established by investigators, she had been there through the night. Investigators documented the disturbed stack, the missing boards from the middle layers, the collapsed configuration, the absent banding, and the gap in the fencing she used to enter. The physical evidence made the sequence clear without any ambiguity. Worker statements confirmed she had been explicitly told that morning that the materials were not discarded and the site was closed to the public. Nobody had given her any reason to believe otherwise. According to the final findings, her official cause of death as traumatic asphyxia and crush injuries resulting from sustained compression of the thorax preventing ventilation following the collapse of stacked construction materials after destabilization of the load. It was August 31st, 2014, near Horseshoe Bay in British Columbia, and the ferry terminal was already packed from Labor Day weekend traffic. Cars sat bumper to bumper across the staging lanes, while crews carefully loaded vehicles onto the ferry as small tidal movements kept shifting the vessel against the dock. Lorraine Pike was 54 years old and worked as an insurance claims adjuster in Vancouver. Co-workers later described her as the type of person who argued with almost everyone when things didn't go her way. Whether it's a restaurant staff, store employees, or receptionists, it didn't really matter. And according to multiple people at the terminal that day, she acted like the entire ferry lineup existed just to annoy her personally. She arrived in a white Lexus SUV expecting to catch the next crossing, but holiday traffic had already pushed wait times past an hour. At first, she stayed inside the vehicle, looking irritated but calm enough. That changed once workers started redirecting cars into holding lanes for the next sailing. Lorraine jumped out and marched toward an attendant, loudly demanding to be moved to the front. When the employee explained that loading depended on vehicle balance, she just talked over him before storming back to her car. 20 minutes later, loading finally started. Most drivers followed the instruction to board slowly while the ferry stabilized against the tide, but Lorraine didn't. Instead, witnesses watched her suddenly pull the Lexus out of line and drive along the outer edge of the staging area, bypassing several waiting vehicles. People immediately started honking. One dock worker even waved both arms at her to stop, while another hurried toward the ramp entrance. But before either employee could even reach her, Lorraine rolled down the driver's side window and started yelling again. Witnesses later said Lorraine kept calling the terminal workers incompetent and insisting she wasn't waiting another hour. But by then, the workers weren't yelling because of the argument anymore. They were yelling because the ferry still hadn't fully settled against the dock. As a delivery van ahead started boarding, Lorraine suddenly accelerated and tried squeezing around it. At almost the same moment, a passing wake shifted the ferry sideways a few inches. Her front tire slipped off the ramp first. The SUV jerked hard. She overcorrected, and the entire vehicle dropped nose first into the water. But the worst part is that the impact itself wasn't what killed her. The Lexus remained partially above water for several seconds, and witnesses could see Lorraine moving inside as water rushed through the engine compartment. Crew members threw flotation rings, but the SUV sank fast. Investigators later believed Lorraine lost crucial seconds trying to restart or reverse the SUV instead of escaping immediately. It's a haunting thought to me that she might have been trying to save the car in the very moments she needed to save herself. In the aftermath, her family explored legal action, but surveillance footage showed Lorraine ignoring stop signals and accelerating toward the ramp despite repeated warnings. Her insurance company later denied the claims, stating she knowingly ignored safety instructions. It was a Thursday morning in early March 2017 in a mid-sized neighborhood on the northern edge of Denver, Colorado. The sidewalks were still damp from an overnight frost, and the morning had barely warmed up by the time Denise Grusdek walked through the front door of a small chiropractic office a few blocks from her home. Denise Grusdek was 44 years old and worked as an office administrator for a small property management company. Outside of her day job, Denise hosted a small podcast she had. Launched in late 2015, built around the idea that patients who push back got better outcomes than those who simply followed what they were told. It had a few thousand regular listeners by early 2017, and chiropractic care had come up more than once as something she believed the medical community was too quick to dismiss. She had been dealing with chronic neck stiffness for the better part of 2 years. She had seen a general practitioner about it once, received a referral for physical therapy, and dismissed it without a second thought. Physical therapy, in her view, was for people who did not know how to advocate for themselves. She had done her own research, and she knew what would fix it. That research consisted almost entirely of videos she had been watching online for several months. Chiropractic adjustment clips, specifically high-velocity cervical manipulations, had become a regular habit. She watched them the way some people watch tutorials, forming opinions and building what she believed was a working understanding of the procedure. By early 2017, she had fully convinced herself that a single aggressive neck adjustment was all she needed, and that the only reason she had not gotten one was because no practitioner had been willing to do it properly. That distinction between watching something and understanding it is one that gets people killed more often than I think anyone wants to admit. She booked an appointment at a chiropractic office near her home and arrived with her mind already made up. When the practitioner completed his initial assessment and recommended a conservative course of treatment, starting with soft tissue work and gradual mobilization, Denise rejected it immediately. She told him his approach was too cautious and that her research had already told her what she needed. She was not aggressive about it. She was composed, certain, and completely immovable, which, if anything, is harder to deal with than someone who is just loudly difficult. The practitioner offered alternatives. Denise declined each one. She made it clear she would not be coming back if he was unwilling to perform what she was asking for. He eventually agreed, on the condition that she sign a standard consent form outlining the known risks of the procedure, including, explicitly, the possibility of vascular injury. Denise signed it without reading it and booked a follow-up for the following week. I find it hard to decide which part is worse, that she was warned in writing or that she treated it like a receipt. She returned the next Thursday. The high-velocity cervical manipulation was performed. Within roughly 3 minutes, she told the practitioner she had a sudden and severe headache at the base of her skull. She lost consciousness in the chair shortly after. A receptionist and one other patient in the waiting area heard the commotion and witnessed the immediate aftermath. What had occurred was a vertebral artery dissection, a tear in one of the arteries running along the cervical spine that supplies blood to the brainstem. It is a documented though uncommon complication of high-velocity cervical manipulation, and the brainstem stroke that followed was rapid and irreversible. I think about the consent form whenever a story lands here. She was told it was written down in plain language, and she moved past it without a second thought. The medical examiner determined that Denise died as a result of a brainstem stroke caused by a vertebral artery dissection following a high-velocity cervical manipulation. A formal review was conducted, during which the signed consent form and the documented record showing that Denise had explicitly requested the procedure against the practitioner's initial recommendation were entered as central evidence. The practitioner was not charged. It was June 3, 2017. The morning crowd moved steadily through a large warehouse-style retail store in Georgia. Flatbed carts rattled across polished concrete while employees restocked tall pallets ahead of the weekend rush. Near the returns counter, a line of customers waited with damaged appliances, clothing exchanges, and routine refund requests. Brenda Schultz was 57 and lived about 10 minutes from the warehouse store with her husband Roy, a long-haul truck driver who spent most weeks on the road. She worked part-time as a church secretary, organizing bulletins, schedules, and attendance records. Members of the congregation knew her for correcting small mistakes immediately: wrong dates, wrong hymn numbers, even minor formatting errors. That same attention to detail carried into her shopping habits. Brenda kept receipts in labeled envelopes and believed stores should stand behind every item they sold. Over several years, she filed numerous return requests at the same warehouse location, sometimes bringing items back months after purchase. Staff at the membership desk recognized her name when it appeared on the screen. On this particular morning, she arrived with another dispute. Brenda entered the store pulling a flatbed warehouse cart. Resting on the platform was a large cardboard box containing a portable gasoline generator weighing roughly 68 pounds. She had purchased it more than 2 years earlier and now claimed it had never worked properly. At the returns counter, a supervisor removed the generator from the box and tested it outside the entrance bay. It started normally. When he returned, he explained that power equipment carried a 90-day return policy and that the purchase was far beyond that window. Brenda immediately raised her voice. Witnesses later said she pointed at the receipt and tapped the counter repeatedly while insisting the store should still accept the return. The supervisor repeated the policy and offered to call a manager to review the situation. Brenda refused. She said she would speak to someone in the hardware section herself. Still visibly irritated, she grabbed the handle of the flatbed cart and pulled it away from the counter. Instead of pushing the cart in front of her, she dragged it behind her through the warehouse aisles. The generator box remained unsecured on the smooth metal platform. Brenda walked quickly through the seasonal garden section, pulling the cart one-handed while weaving around other shoppers. Employees nearby later said she continued speaking loudly about the return policy as she moved through the store. At about 10:44 a.m., she approached a pallet stacked with large bags of mulch that narrowed the aisle. Without stopping, Brenda pivoted sharply to the left to move around it while still pulling the cart behind her. The sudden turn caused the cart to swing outward behind her. As the wheels shifted sideways, the heavy generator box slid across the smooth metal platform toward the edge. The box tipped over the edge and dropped off the cart. One corner struck Brenda's lower leg just above the ankle. The impact knocked her off balance, and she fell sideways onto the concrete floor as the generator box landed beside her. A nearby employee saw the fall and ran toward her while calling for assistance over a handheld radio. Brenda was conscious and shouting in pain, gripping the cart handle while trying to pull herself upright. The employee told her to stay down until help arrived. Brenda attempted to stand anyway. As she shifted her weight, her injured leg collapsed beneath her. She lost balance and fell again, this time striking the side of her head against the concrete floor. After the second fall, she stopped speaking and remained motionless. Employees cleared the aisle while another worker called emergency services. Within minutes, store staff reported that Brenda was breathing but unresponsive. Paramedics arrived shortly afterward and began treatment at the scene before transporting her to a nearby hospital. CT scans revealed a severe traumatic brain injury, including a large subdural hematoma caused by the second impact with the floor. Despite emergency surgery, pressure inside her skull continued to rise as bleeding spread across the surface of the brain. Brenda Schultz was pronounced dead later that evening. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death blunt force trauma to the head sustained during the fall. Security footage confirmed the generator had slid from the cart before the initial impact, and that the fatal injury occurred when Brenda struck her head during the second collapse. Store management later reviewed cart handling policies and reminded staff to secure heavy items on flatbed carts to prevent similar incidents. It was October 3, 2015, in Denton County, Texas, the kind of suburb where every strip mall looks the same, and there's a gym on practically every other block. Nothing about the area stood out. Neither did Gail Pitsley, at least not at first. Gail was 38 years old and worked as an office administrator for a mid-sized logistics company. Monday through Friday, same desk, same hours. She was organized, punctual, and by most accounts easy enough to work with as long as things went her way. Outside of work, the gym was her thing, had been for years. She went 5 days a week without fail, and the tanning bed was as much a part of her routine as the elliptical. Maintaining her tan wasn't vanity to Gail, or at least that's not how she saw it. It was upkeep, part of the program, non-negotiable. The facility she used had a standard policy, 12 minutes per session, with a mandatory 24-hour gap between visits. Basic stuff, put in place to prevent the kind of cumulative skin damage that builds up faster than most people realize. Gail knew the policy. She just didn't think it applied to her. She complained about it regularly, to the front desk staff, to whoever was nearby, to people who hadn't asked. 12 minutes wasn't enough. The wait period was excessive. She'd been tanning for years and nothing bad had ever happened. So clearly she knew her own limits better than any laminated sign on a wall did. I mean, I've heard that logic before, and it never ends well. Staff had cut her session short on more than one occasion after she refused to come out on her own. There were documented complaints filed against her going back several months. At some point in late September 2015, she figured out that the facility's side entrance used a keypad code that hadn't been changed in over a year. She started letting herself in after closing. No staff, no timers, no one to tell her when she'd had enough. The access logs told most of the story afterward. She had entered after hours at least a dozen times across roughly 3 weeks, staying well beyond any duration a supervised session would have allowed. Some entries showed her inside for over an hour at a stretch. She wasn't testing boundaries. She had thrown them out entirely. The first sign that something was wrong came from her co-workers. Around mid-October, people at her office started noticing that her skin looked unusual, not tan, damaged. Red in uneven patches, peeling in others, with areas along her shoulders and forearms that looked raw and irritated. Gail brushed it off, said she'd just overdone it a little and that it would settle down on its own. She kept coming to work. She kept going to the gym, though there were no official tanning session records after the 3rd week of October, only keypad entry logs tied to her after-hours access. By late October, she had stopped showing up to the office entirely. A co-worker who called to check on her described her as sounding exhausted and difficult to follow in conversation. The skin damage had progressed significantly by that point. The burned areas across her back and shoulders had broken down into open wounds, and without any medical treatment, those wounds had become severely infected. Bacteria entering the bloodstream through compromised skin is one of the more straightforward paths to sepsis, and Gail had left that path wide open. For weeks, she was found unresponsive at her residence on October 24, 2015. The medical examiner confirmed the cause of death as sepsis resulting from infected radiation burns across a significant portion of her upper body. The skin breakdown had been extensive enough that the infection spread quickly once it took hold, progressing to multi-organ failure before anyone knew how serious her condition had become. The facility's access records were reviewed as part of the process and confirmed the pattern of unauthorized after-hours entries. Every visit was logged with a timestamp. No fault was found on the part of the facility. The sessions Gail had complained about for months, the ones she called unreasonable and excessive, had been designed to prevent exactly what her autopsy described. The case was closed without further findings. It was July 14, 2015, in Orlando, Florida. At a crowded water park, a woman refused to leave a ride exit, insisting she shouldn't have to wait again. It didn't seem serious at first, but within minutes, her decision pulled someone else into a space designed to move without stopping. Donna Pelchat was 52, working as a tour coordinator. That day, she was at the park with her husband and a visiting family friend, someone she had personally invited because she wanted everything to go smoothly. That was kind of her thing. She liked being in control of plans, keeping things on track, making sure nothing slowed them down. And when something didn't match what she expected, she didn't just let it go. She stepped in and tried to fix it herself. After finishing a log flume ride, she didn't follow the marked exit like everyone else. Instead, she stayed near the unloading platform and told the operator she shouldn't have to go through the full line again. She pointed to a separate access point she had noticed earlier and insisted she should be allowed through that way. Staff told her clearly to move along, but she stayed right where she was. And honestly, most people understand those priority lines are there for guests who truly need them, which makes it surprising she tried to use that as an excuse. As the next boat approached the unload area, operators shifted their attention to the incoming riders. In that short gap, Donna stepped past a waist-high barrier and slipped through a side service gate that hadn't fully latched. Behind it was a narrow maintenance walkway running alongside the runout channel. Wet, uneven, and clearly not meant for guests. Her husband followed right behind her as staff started shouting for both of them to come back, but Donna kept going along the narrow edge, saying they'd just get on from there instead of going all the way around again. He stayed close, reaching toward her like he was trying to steady her because the ground under them was getting slick from the constant water flow. By then, the next log had already gone over the drop and entered the runout channel. And that's the part people don't realize. Once a ride like that is moving, it doesn't just stop on command. The boat came in fast along the guided track, water pushing out around it as it started to slow, but not nearly fast enough. As Donna kept moving forward on the slippery edge, her foot suddenly slid out from under her, and she fell sideways straight into the channel. Her husband reacted instantly, reaching to grab her, but instead of pulling her back, the motion threw him off balance too, and he went in right after her, just seconds before the boat reached them. There was nowhere for it to go. The front of the log pressed both of them into the concrete sidewall, pinning them in place as the water surged around them. It wasn't some dramatic impact. It was tight, mechanical, and unforgiving. From the platform, it happened fast, but not fast enough to miss what was happening. Operators hit the emergency stop the moment they saw them, but the ride still needed distance to come to a full stop. By the time it did, both of them were trapped in the channel. Staff and lifeguards rushed in immediately, getting into the water to free them. It took time to shift the boat enough to pull them out from the sidewall. By the time they were brought back onto the platform, neither of them was responding. CPR was started right there as emergency responders were called in, but despite continued efforts, both were later pronounced dead. The findings pointed to crushing injuries to the chest, along with drowning, which lines up with being pinned underwater in an active ride channel. The investigation later confirmed that the ride itself was working exactly as it should. The boat stayed on its track, and staff followed emergency procedures. Everything came back to that one decision: Donna stepping into a restricted area and her husband following right behind her. It was May 14th, 2016, in a quiet residential neighborhood in Maricopa County, Arizona. By mid-morning, the temperature had already pushed past 90 degrees, dry, relentless Arizona heat. The sky was clear. No wind. There was nothing about the conditions that day that should have led to what happened. Nothing except the decisions Tylet made before she ever picked up that chainsaw. Tylet Droft was 44 years old. She worked part-time managing rental properties in the area, a job that suited her personality. She was detail-oriented to a fault, the kind of person who kept records of every email, every phone call, every minor infraction she felt needed documenting. Neighbors described her as persistent. Some said stubborn. She wasn't cruel by most accounts. She just had a very firm idea of what was hers, and she held on to that idea like it was a principle worth defending at any cost. The dispute with her next-door neighbor had been building for months. A large tree sat close to the shared fence line, and several branches had grown outward, extending roughly 6 to 8 feet over onto Tylet's side. To most people, that's a manageable inconvenience. To Tylet, it was a violation. She had made it clear, repeatedly, that those branches were hers to deal with, but that the neighbor was legally responsible for the removal cost. The neighbor disagreed. No agreement was ever reached. 3 days before the 14th, Tylet told the neighbor directly that she would handle it herself. She purchased a gas-powered chainsaw shortly after. She had no prior experience operating one. A licensed professional quoted her a fair price to do the job correctly. She turned it down, calling it a scam. This is where I have to be honest. The moment she rejected professional help and decided to do this alone, she made the most consequential decision of her life. Everything after that was downstream of that one choice. On the morning of the 14th, the neighbor came over and warned her. He told her not to cut overhead limbs without proper rigging, without something to control where the branch would fall. She argued back, made it clear she didn't need his permission or anyone's help. Then he left, and she got to work. She dragged the ladder to the fence side and spent a few minutes repositioning it after the first placement felt unstable. The soil was too uneven to fix properly, but she seemed satisfied enough to proceed. She primed the saw, pulled the cord until it caught, and climbed with the engine already running. The limb she targeted was roughly 8 inches in diameter, above shoulder height from the second highest rung. To cut it safely, you rig it first to control where it falls, then work in sequence. A relief cut to release tension, then the finishing cut from above. None of that happened. She went straight into a single top-down cut with no rigging and no staged approach. The saw bound almost immediately as the limb compressed under its own weight. She forced it, leaning past what the ladder could support. The limb split and dropped, striking her across the upper chest. She fell approximately 5 feet. The chainsaw was still running when her grip failed. Before it hit the ground and stalled, the chain made brief contact across her upper torso. She landed hard on her back, her head and neck striking the ground with significant force. She lost responsiveness almost immediately. He called 911 right after he heard the engine stop and the impact. Responders arrived and found her unresponsive in the yard, the saw lying nearby, the ladder tipped over. There was nothing that could be done on scene. Investigators documented everything: the unstable ladder, the absence of protective equipment, the incorrect cutting method. Witness statements confirmed she had been warned that morning and proceeded anyway. Her cause of death was judged by the medical examiner to be fatal blunt force head trauma with cervical spine injury from the fall, with associated non-fatal chainsaw lacerations sustained during the descent. The chainsaw wounds did not kill her. The fall did. Tylet Droft died in her own backyard over a tree branch. The property line she fought so hard to defend was still there when the investigators left. The tree was still there too. It was July 22, 2017, in Riverside, California, and the heat had pushed most people indoors by early afternoon. Air conditioners hummed through the neighborhood, while sprinklers clicked across dry front lawns in the middle of another brutal summer weekend. Lucy Harrow was 51 years old and had lived in the same suburban duplex for nearly 20 years. According to her neighbors, she had become increasingly difficult after her divorce a few years earlier. What started as small complaints about trash bins and parking slowly turned into constant arguments with almost everyone on the block. But her biggest obsession was the mango tree growing in her neighbor's backyard. The tree leaned over the shared fence, and several large branches stretched above Lucy's patio. Most people would probably want those branches trimmed back. I know I'd be worried about the mess or the shade, but Lucy was the opposite. She insisted that anything hanging over her property legally belonged to her, especially if it's in season. The neighbor had been trying to prune the tree for months. Fruit kept falling onto both patios, branches scraped the roof during windy nights, and one large limb had started cracking after strong winds earlier that week. Eventually, the neighbor hired 2 licensed tree workers to remove several heavy branches before somebody got hurt. That Saturday afternoon, the workers arrived with ropes, chainsaws, and climbing gear. They started sectioning off part of the backyard while explaining to both homeowners that nobody should stand underneath the cutting area. Lucy came outside almost immediately, holding her phone. And what's alarming to me while reading through this was how committed she was to proving she was right. At first, she stood near the fence filming the workers while accusing them of trespassing. Then, she started yelling that the branches over her patio were her property and kept repeating it. She even threatened legal action if they cut them down. The workers repeatedly stopped what they were doing to explain the situation calmly, but every pause only made Lucy louder. Neighbors later said she kept interrupting people, talking over everyone, and moving closer every time someone asked her to back away. One worker climbed into the tree and attached a rope system to a large branch hanging over Lucy's patio. The plan was to cut it into sections and slowly lower each piece safely into the neighbor's yard. But Lucy refused to leave the drop zone and kept filming even as neighbors tried pulling her back inside. As the branch was being lowered, witnesses said Lucy suddenly rushed toward the rope line before anyone could stop her. She grabbed the rope while screaming that the workers were stealing from her property. The branch immediately twisted sideways instead of coming down straight. One end slammed into the top of the fence, bounced awkwardly, and swung back faster than anyone nearby could react. The thicker end struck Lucy across the side of her head and shoulder with enough force to throw her backward onto the concrete patio. And what makes this whole thing so frustrating to me is that the workers were actually trying to do it carefully. Witnesses later said Lucy actually tried sitting back up while still yelling at the workers, but within seconds, she became confused and started struggling to stay conscious. Blood was already visible near her ear by the time neighbors called 911. Paramedics arrived within minutes and transported her to the hospital in critical condition. Doctors found multiple skull fractures and severe bleeding around the brain. The branch impact and the fall onto the concrete caused massive head trauma that quickly increased pressure inside her skull. Lucy died later that evening. Investigators ruled the death accidental. Witnesses and cell phone footage showed workers repeatedly warning Lucy to stay away before she grabbed the lowering rope herself. Authorities concluded the branch changed direction after the rope tension was disrupted, and no charges were filed because investigators found no evidence that the crew had ignored safety procedures. It was a Saturday morning in late October 2017 in a small town on the outskirts of Tucson, Arizona. The air was dry, the range was open, and by mid-morning, everything had already gone wrong. Marcy Delvo was 41 years old and lived alone in a single-story home about 2 miles from the gun range that had been her personal enemy for the better part of a year. On top of her part-time work, Marcy ran a local advocacy YouTube channel she had started in early 2016. It was not large, a few hundred subscribers, but it was consistent. She posted videos documenting what she called community negligence, usually targeting local businesses or services she believed were operating without accountability. The gun range had already appeared in 2 of her uploads before that morning, both framing it as a noise hazard that local channels had failed to address. But Marcy had a particular quality that the people around her knew well. She did not let things go. A noise complaint that most people would file once and forget about was, for Marcy, the beginning of a campaign. She had contacted the range ownership multiple times over the course of several months. None of it produced the result she wanted, which was the range shutting down, or, at a minimum, limiting its hours significantly. What I find interesting about Marcy is that she was not entirely wrong about the noise. People who lived near that range had complained before. The difference was that everyone else eventually moved on. Marcy never did. By late 2017, she had convinced herself that showing up in person was the only way anyone would take her seriously. That belief, more than anything else, is what put her there. That morning, She arrived at the range just before 10. It was a Saturday, which meant the place was active. Several shooters were already on the lanes, bags down, running through their sessions. Marcy walked past the entry signage without stopping and made her way toward the main area where the range owner was speaking with a group near the far end. She was not there to listen. She had already decided how the conversation was going to go. The argument that followed was loud enough that multiple people on the range stopped what they were doing. Witnesses later described her as agitated from the moment she arrived, pointing toward the surrounding neighborhood and raising her voice steadily as the owner tried to respond. It went on for several minutes with neither side getting anywhere. That kind of standoff, where the other person just will not hear you, reminds me of something I talked about in an earlier episode. That specific dynamic where someone walks in with a conclusion already formed and treats the conversation as a formality. You cannot reason with that. You can only wait for it to end. What happened next took only a few seconds. At some point during the confrontation, Marcy turned toward a nearby bench where a shooter had set down his range bag between sessions. The bag was unzipped. She reached into it. Witnesses said it looked deliberate, like she was trying to pull the firearm out to make a point about how carelessly weapons were handled on the property. The shooter, whose bag it was, had stepped back from the bench and was standing a few feet away. Nobody had time to react. The firearm was chambered. The moment her grip tightened and her finger slipped inside the trigger guard and pressed the trigger as she pulled it free, it discharged. The shot entered her upper right abdomen. She went down immediately. I think about that a lot. The shooter was right there. The bag was right there. Not a single person in that space expected her to reach in. That is the thing about someone who is fully committed to making a point. They stop calculating risk entirely. Other shooters moved toward her. There was nothing that could be done at that point. Marcy Delvo was pronounced dead later that afternoon. The cause was a single gunshot wound to the upper abdomen, resulting in fatal damage to her liver and the vessels surrounding it. Blood loss was the determining factor. The manner of death was ruled accidental. The shooter faced no charges, given that he had not been in contact with the firearm at the moment it discharged. The range remained open. The case was closed. It was November 28, 2013. Outside a large retail store in Mesquite, Texas, early Black Friday shoppers gathered hours before the sale began. Employees staged pallets of electronics inside taped-off aisles. Security staff monitored the entrances as the crowd slowly thickened, waiting for the midnight doors to open. Among the early arrivals was Donna Fitch, 54. She had previously worked as a data entry clerk, but left the job in 2011 after a back injury, she said, which prevented her from working full-time. Disability checks covered basic expenses, while she earned extra money reselling discounted merchandise online. Bargain hunting had become part of Donna's routine. She tracked major sales months in advance, printing store ads and marking them with notes and highlighted prices. Living alone in Garland, Texas, she spent much of her time visiting retail stores, looking for discounted items she could resell online. Neighbors later described frequent arguments over parking spaces and return policies. On that evening, Donna arrived at the retail store shortly before 5:40 p.m., more than 4 hours before a Black Friday television sale. She drove a motorized cart straight to the electronics aisle and stopped beside pallets of boxed televisions that had been staged behind temporary barriers. Employees were directing shoppers to wait behind taped lines until the official sale time. Donna ignored the instructions almost immediately. Witnesses later said she pushed the cart forward until its rubber bumper pressed against the wrapped stack of televisions. When an employee asked her to move back with the rest of the crowd, she refused. She insisted she had arrived early and had the right to stay where she was. Several shoppers later said she began arguing loudly and refused to let anyone move ahead of her in the line. As the aisle filled, Donna continued inching the cart forward whenever staff looked away. When another customer stepped between her and the pallet, she honked the cart horn and demanded they move. Employees repeatedly warned shoppers to stay back until the display was opened safely, but each time they turned to manage the crowd, Donna rolled closer to the televisions. By 9:45 p.m., nearly 200 shoppers had packed into the aisle waiting for the sale. Donna parked the cart against the pallet and stood beside it, watching the stack closely. At 9:58 p.m., an employee stepped forward and began cutting the plastic wrap with a box cutter to open the display. Donna moved in front of the cart, pushed to the edge of the pallet, and complained the employee was taking too long after she had been waiting for hours. Before the employee finished cutting the plastic wrap, Donna stepped away from the cart and pushed directly to the front of the pallet. Ignoring another warning to step back, she grabbed the loose edge of plastic hanging from the cut line and pulled down with both hands. The wrap tore open instantly, releasing the tension that had been holding the stacked televisions in place. The first box struck Donna across the chest and shoulder. The others followed, pushing her backward into the motorized cart behind her. Her legs tangled against the cart's metal foot platform, forcing her upper body over the front bumper. Her head snapped backward and struck the linoleum floor. 2 boxes fell onto her torso, while others slid across the aisle. For several seconds, the crowd continued pressing toward the televisions, assuming the sale had begun, before a nearby shopper noticed Donna lying motionless beneath the boxes and called for help. Security reached the aisle within minutes and found her unresponsive with shallow breathing and called emergency services. Paramedics arrived about 12 minutes later, removed the boxes, stabilized her neck, and began resuscitation as she was placed on a stretcher. Donna never regained consciousness and was pronounced dead at a nearby hospital. The medical examiner ruled the death accidental, caused by severe head trauma after her skull struck the floor. Store management closed the electronics aisle and suspended the sale, while police and emergency crews cleared the scene. It was October 2016, and the suburbs of Delaware County, Pennsylvania, were experiencing their usual fall construction season. Homeowners were rushing to complete outdoor projects before winter, and the sound of hammers and power tools echoed through residential neighborhoods as people added decks, sheds, and other improvements to their properties. Janice Greber was a 58-year-old insurance claims processor who'd lived in the same house for over 15 years. She worked from home most days, which gave her plenty of time to monitor everything happening in her neighborhood. Janice had always been meticulous about following rules and regulations, and she expected the same from everyone around her. When her next-door neighbor started building a large deck in his backyard that spring, Janice became convinced he was doing it without proper permits. What really bothers me about Janice's story is how a simple property dispute turned into a dangerous obsession. She'd called the township multiple times to report the construction, but officials told her the permits were in order. That wasn't good enough for Janice. She was absolutely certain they were wrong, and she was determined to prove it. She started taking photos of the construction from every angle, measuring distances from her own yard, and documenting what she believed were code violations. The deck was completed in late summer, but Janice's investigation was just getting started. She'd convinced herself that the foundation wasn't built to code and that the support beams were improperly spaced. The only way to prove it, she decided, was to get underneath the structure and take detailed measurements herself. So in early October, Janice began crawling under her neighbor's deck on a regular basis. And then this is the part where things get really disturbing. Janice made this a routine. Every few days, when her neighbor wasn't home, she'd squeeze through the gap between the deck and the ground to examine the construction from below. The space was cramped, filled with old construction debris, and definitely not designed for human access. But Janice was convinced she was gathering crucial evidence that would vindicate her complaints. During one of these unauthorized inspections in mid-October, Janice punctured her right hand on a rusty nail that was protruding from a piece of old lumber left under the deck. The wound was deep and jagged, exactly the kind of injury that requires immediate medical attention and a tetanus shot. But Janice was more concerned about explaining how she got the injury and admitting she'd been trespassing than she was about the cut. She cleaned it with water from a garden hose, wrapped it with a dirty cloth, and went home. Over the next week, Janice's hand became increasingly painful and stiff. She attributed the discomfort to stress from her ongoing battle with the neighbor and kept applying basic first aid. What she didn't realize was that the rusty nail had introduced tetanus bacteria into the wound through the deep puncture. By the time the characteristic jaw stiffness appeared 10 days later, the infection had already taken hold. Janice's condition deteriorated rapidly over the following days. The muscle spasms started in her jaw and neck, then spread throughout her body. Her family members noticed she was having trouble speaking and eating, but Janice insisted it was just tension from dealing with the permit situation. When the spasms became severe enough to affect her breathing, her sister finally convinced her to seek medical help. By the time Janice reached the emergency room, the tetanus infection had progressed too far for effective treatment. Despite aggressive medical intervention including muscle relaxants and respiratory support, she died from respiratory failure caused by severe tetanus-induced muscle spasms. The medical examiner confirmed tetanus as the cause of death, with the puncture wound from the rusty nail identified as the source of infection. Janice's obsessive documentation of her neighbor's deck was found in her home office. Hundreds of photos, measurements, and notes that proved absolutely nothing. Township records confirmed that all permits for the deck construction had been properly obtained and that the work met all local building codes. The case was ruled an accidental death caused by tetanus infection resulting from an untreated puncture wound sustained during unauthorized entry onto private property. It was October 19, 2017, at a large theme park in Williamsburg, Virginia, during a seasonal Halloween event. In the middle of a crowded scare zone transition, one guest stepped past a clearly marked boundary to get closer footage, and within seconds, a controlled performance turned into a fatal fall that no one could reverse in time. That night, Cheryl Motes, 50, a customer service supervisor, was at the park with co-workers after her shift, treating it as a casual outing. At work, she was used to stepping into complaints and pushing for answers, and that habit carried over into how she handled things in public. If something didn't match what she expected, she questioned it and kept pushing until she got the response she wanted. During one of the roaming scare segments, she positioned herself closer than most guests, watching the performers move through the area. Several of them were on stilts, standing roughly 4 feet off the ground, wearing extended creature costumes built on lightweight aluminum frames with foam outer shells. Cheryl began pointing things out to people nearby, insisting the figures weren't mechanical and describing what she believed were visible seams and movement patterns. As the segment ended, performers began moving through a roped-off side path meant strictly for staff and cast. Cheryl followed along the barrier with her phone raised, trying to get clearer footage. She called out to one of the performers, asking to see the costume up close and even try it on. A staff member told her no and directed her to stay behind the rope, but she didn't drop it. She repeated the request, raised her voice, and questioned why it wasn't allowed. Even as people around her began moving away, she stayed fixed on the performer. Instead, she leaned farther over the rope, trying to angle her phone upward. When that still wasn't enough, she stepped through a gap in the partially open rope line and entered the restricted pathway. At that moment, one of the performers, later identified as Ethan Caldwell, 27, a seasonal stilt actor, was moving through the exit route. He was elevated on drywall-style peg stilts, secured with leg straps and a waist harness. With a headpiece that limited his downward visibility, the costume extended his height further with a lightweight frame, making balance heavily dependent on controlled, predictable movement. Cheryl moved directly toward him, still filming. Staff immediately called out for her to step back, but she didn't. Instead, she closed the distance further, stepping into his path just as he began to pivot toward the exit corridor. The sudden obstruction forced an immediate adjustment. With limited visibility and no space to move around her, Caldwell shifted his weight to compensate. It wasn't enough. His right stilt came down slightly off-angle near the edge of the walkway. With his balance already compromised mid-turn and the added height of the costume frame, the correction failed. The structure amplified the instability instead of absorbing it. He went forward. Directly ahead, along the edge of the pathway, were decorative Halloween props. Jagged, spike-like elements rising at uneven angles from a low base, set as a visual barrier between the path and the themed area. The fall was uncontrolled. From several feet up, his upper body pitched forward first. With his arms restricted inside the costume frame, he couldn't break the fall. His momentum carried him down hard onto the ground and the concealed base structure beneath the display. The impact hit across his upper chest and side at once. The force, combined with his height, drove him into the rigid edge of the base before the costume frame collapsed over him, pinning him briefly. The sound changed everything. At first, the crowd didn't react. Then, people nearby stepped back abruptly. He wasn't moving. Witnesses rushed in immediately, lifting sections of the costume and pulling him clear. Caldwell was conscious, disoriented, and in visible pain, but responsive as medical staff stabilized him. Cheryl, who had been standing directly in front of him, didn't have time to move when he came down. The forward momentum carried part of the collapsing frame into her, knocking her backward onto the hard walkway surface. She struck the ground with force, her head and upper body taking the impact. She went down immediately. Staff redirected attention as the situation escalated. Cheryl was unresponsive, with heavy bleeding and no reaction to verbal commands. The park's on-site medical team arrived within minutes and began emergency intervention, but the extent of the injury was severe. Emergency medical services transported both of them to a nearby hospital. Caldwell was treated for multiple blunt force injuries and fractures and later stabilized. Cheryl, however, was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The cause of death was determined to be severe blunt force trauma to the head and upper body, resulting in critical internal injuries. It was September 3rd, 2017, on a residential street in St. Louis County, Missouri. Late summer in the Midwest, the heat hadn't fully broken yet, and the air sat heavy. It was a Sunday. Most people on that block were inside. The ones who weren't would remember that day for a long time. Myrna Clave was 52 years old. She worked in retail, had for years. People who knew her described her as someone who didn't let things slide, especially when she felt like someone was overstepping. She had a history of confrontations over what she saw as authority being used where it didn't belong. It wasn't that she was looking for conflict, it's more that she had a firm sense of what she believed were her rights and challenging that required a response. Co-workers described her as someone who would argue a return policy to the bitter end, not out of spite, but because she genuinely believed the rule was wrong and that silence meant acceptance. That part of her personality matters here, because on September 3rd, it drove every decision she made. Officers responded to a call about a barricaded individual inside a nearby residence who was believed to be armed. Units arrived, assessed the situation, and established a perimeter. Residents were instructed to stay back, a safety boundary drawn because no one on that street knew what was about to happen inside that house. Neighbors who complied moved to the back of their homes or stayed low inside. The street cleared out quickly. Everyone except Myrna. Myrna came out of her home and didn't like what she saw. Officers blocking off the street, being told where she could and couldn't stand. She began arguing, told them they had no right to restrict her movement, asked for badge numbers, threatened complaints. Officers told her repeatedly to retreat behind the line. She refused. At one point, officers physically repositioned her. She went, and then she came back, returning to the same spot near the curb, a position with a direct line of sight to the residence. That curb was where she had decided to stand. From there, she was directly in front of the house, offset from the officers' firing angles, exposed to anything coming out, not between officers and their line of fire. Officers continued telling her to move. She continued refusing. There was a moment, brief but noticeable, where the scene shifted. Commands sharpened. Officers adjusted positions, attention locked onto the structure. Something inside had changed. Then the suspect fired from inside the residence. Officers responded with directed fire toward visible openings. Body camera footage would later confirm that even as shots were exchanged, commands for Myrna to get to cover were still being given out loud, not once, but multiple times from multiple officers. She didn't move. A round fired from inside the residence exited through a window opening toward the street. It struck her in the upper torso. Given her position, aligned with the residence openings and outside police firing paths, she was exposed only to rounds from the suspect, not crossfire. She dropped immediately where she was standing. Once the suspect withdrew from view and officers could safely approach, they reached her. EMS responded and assessed her on scene. She was declared deceased at the location, in the same spot she had refused to leave. This one is hard to process because, unlike some of the cases we cover, there were multiple people actively trying to keep her safe. That's not a failure of information. She had the information. She just didn't move. Body camera footage from multiple officers documented every command given and every repositioning attempt. The warnings, the physical repositioning, her return to the curb, all of it on record. Ballistics confirmed the fatal round originated from inside the barricaded residence, not from law enforcement. The suspect was the source. The medical examiner listed her official cause of death as a penetrating gunshot wound to the upper torso, resulting in rapid internal hemorrhage, sustained from a round fired by the suspect while she remained in an unsecured active scene. Investigators noted she had been repeatedly ordered to leave and return to the exposed position voluntarily. That line appears in the official record without commentary. It doesn't need any. It was December 19, 2015 in Schaumburg, Illinois, and freezing rain had already started coating the parking lots outside the shopping centers near a mall. Inside a crowded beauty store that was only minutes from closing, exhausted holiday shoppers rushed through the aisles trying to finish last-minute Christmas shopping before the weather got worse. One of the last-minute shoppers was Cameron Mendez, 39. She was a virtual assistant and lived the kind of isolated remote work life in her apartment. But when I looked at her digital footprint, Cameron was anything but quiet. She was a digital vigilante. Between caring for her 2 dogs, she lived for the call-out. She's even a top contributor to Facebook groups and usually spends her nights dissecting return policies and hunting for scams. According to friends and family, Cameron took small inconveniences personally and had a habit of recording confrontations anytime she felt disrespected. At first, she claimed it was for evidence. The situations usually escalated once the camera came out. Now, I'm all for accountability, but there's a big difference in collecting evidence and looking for trouble. Her sister later admitted Cameron had already been removed from multiple businesses during arguments involving coupons, refunds, and employees she accused of being rude. That night, Cameron entered the cosmetics store looking for a discounted holiday makeup bundle advertised online. The store was packed with last-minute Christmas shoppers when the cashier explained the deal only worked through online checkout. The employee offered to help place the order, but witnesses said Cameron became confrontational almost immediately. Now, most of us would have just taken the help and moved on, but Cameron saw a helpful gesture differently. She repeatedly interrupted the cashier, then pulled out her phone and started recording the workers while loudly claiming she was being disrespected. The store manager even tried explaining the policy again, but Cameron kept cutting her off as nearby shoppers stopped to watch. Then, Cameron suddenly jumped backward and screamed that an employee had assaulted her. Security footage later confirmed nobody touched her, but shoppers near the entrance only heard someone yelling that a woman had been attacked during an already crowded holiday rush. As people instinctively moved away from the front registers, confusion spread quickly through the packed store. A man carrying several shopping bags bumped into a holiday display while squeezing toward the exit, sending glass perfume bottles crashing across the tile floor. Lotion, makeup products, and broken glass spread across the walkway almost instantly as the entrance became jammed with shoppers trying to leave at the same time. Employees started yelling for people to slow down, but the front section of the store had already become chaotic. Meanwhile, Cameron was still trying to push through the crowd, the very crowd she had initiated herself. Then, she stepped directly onto spilled lotion near the broken display, and her foot slipped almost immediately. It's a split-second loss of footing. She fell backward hard enough for the back of her head to strike the tile floor near the entrance shelving. But here's the truly tragic part. The worst injuries happened after the fall. People behind her were still trying to reach the exit, and many couldn't see her on the floor beneath the collapsed displays and scattered shopping baskets. Several customers stumbled while trying to avoid broken glass and spilled products, while others were pushed forward by the crowd behind them. One witness later told investigators he thought he was stepping over debris. Within seconds, multiple people accidentally stepped onto Cameron before store employees and security finally cleared the entrance area. Paramedics arrived within minutes due to increased holiday emergency staffing nearby. Cameron was transported to a local hospital in critical condition, but doctors could not stop the internal bleeding caused by the compression injuries. The coroner later found multiple broken ribs, severe internal trauma, and signs of traumatic asphyxia. In simple terms, the pressure against her chest became so intense that she could no longer breathe properly while her internal organs were being crushed. And for me, that's such a horrifying way to die, getting crushed by the weight of the panic you helped create. Investigators later reconstructed the incident using surveillance footage and witness interviews, and ultimately concluded the panic inside the store was caused by Cameron's false assault claim combined with crowd confusion during an already packed holiday rush. And I have to say, Cameron finally got the evidence she always wanted on her phone, just not the version she expected. No criminal charges were filed against the store because employees had repeatedly tried calming the situation, though the business was later cited for overcrowded entrance displays. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late July 2016 in a residential neighborhood on the eastern edge of Phoenix, Arizona. The temperature had already pushed past 104 degrees, and most people on the block had the good sense to stay inside. Cora Belson was 38 years old and owned a modest single-story home on a quiet street she had lived on for nearly 6 years. Alongside her bookkeeping work, Cora ran a home and property blog she had been building since 2015. It had grown steadily to a few thousand readers, mostly homeowners interested in renovation and property management. She wrote with authority on everything from landscaping to boundary disputes, and her readers trusted her recommendations. The fence situation with her neighbor had made it into at least one post, framed as a case study in how to handle difficult neighbors on your own terms. Cora was the kind of neighbor who kept a mental log and acted on every item, whose trash can stayed out too long, whose dog wandered too close to her garden, whose fence post leaned 2 inches in the wrong direction. She addressed all of it, directly, and without much patience, for pushback. Her neighbors knew better than to dismiss her complaints. That never went well for anyone. The dispute with the man next door had been building all summer over a section of shared fencing where Cora believed he had made modifications without consulting her. From that point forward, anything connected to that fence was a matter of principle, and she had made that clear to anyone who would listen. So when he noticed a wasp nest on that same fence post in mid-July and told her it was large enough to need a professional, that he had already looked into getting someone out, Cora shut it down immediately. It was her fence, her nest, and her call. He backed off. He had learned by then that pushing back only made things worse. Being given a way out and still rejecting it, not for a better plan, but because it felt like losing, that kind of stubbornness quietly closes off options before you even realize it. She did not call anyone else either. A few days after that conversation, she went into her garage and came back out with an aerosol can she was confident would handle it. Based on what was found at the scene, the can was a general-purpose household lubricant spray, not a wasp or hornet-specific product. It would have done nothing to a colony of that size under any circumstances. She approached the nest with no protective clothing, no gloves, nothing covering her face or neck. That choice alone tells you everything about where her head was that afternoon. She began spraying directly at the nest from close range. The spray did not disperse the colony. What it did was agitate it. Within seconds, the wasps responded. 2 neighbors observed what followed, one from a driveway 2 houses down, and the man next door who had stepped outside at the sound of the commotion. Both described the swarm as immediate and concentrated, targeting her face and neck almost entirely. She stumbled backward onto the lawn within roughly 90 seconds of the first sting. That margin, 90 seconds, is something that genuinely unsettles me. She was on her own property, in broad daylight, with neighbors close enough to see everything, and none of that made any difference once it started. She had no documented history of a diagnosed allergy. But an undetected sensitivity to wasp venom is more common than most people realize, and a concentrated number of stings to the face and throat accelerates anaphylaxis in ways that even a mild underlying sensitivity cannot withstand. Her airway was compromised before anyone reached her. The neighbor next door was the first to get to her. There was nothing he could do by that point. Cora Belson did not survive the afternoon. The cause of death was anaphylactic shock triggered by multiple wasp stings concentrated around her face and neck, with findings confirming an undiagnosed hypersensitivity to the venom. The incident was ruled accidental. No one else was held responsible, including the neighbor who had already warned her, and the case was closed shortly after. It was October 19th, 2018, in a quiet residential subdivision in Plano, Texas. Late afternoon light settled over a row of fenced backyards as residents returned home from work. Lawnmowers and sprinklers hummed across the block, while neighbors moved between garages and patios. Among them was Vivian Truax, 52, who worked from home processing insurance claims. Outside of work, she focused heavily on neighborhood issues as secretary of the Homeowners Association, regularly documenting rule violations and reporting them to the board. Neighbors knew her for printed notices, photographs of yards, and long emails quoting HOA rules line by line. She frequently reported overgrown grass, holiday decorations left up too long, vehicles parked improperly in driveways, and trash cans visible from the street, leading to frequent arguments with neighbors. During the previous summer, a new resident, Carla Mendoza, installed a 6-foot wooden privacy fence along the back property line, separating the two homes. Within days, Vivian began disputing its placement. She insisted the fence crossed roughly 2 inches into her property. Carla had hired a licensed contractor and provided the HOA with a copy of the property survey used during installation. The measurements showed the fence sitting inside her own lot. The HOA reviewed the documents and closed the complaint. Vivian refused to accept the decision. Over the next several weeks, she repeatedly photographed the fence and sent multiple emails to the HOA board, insisting that the survey had to be wrong. When the board stopped responding, she began confronting Carla directly across the fence line. On the afternoon of October 19th, Vivian walked into her backyard carrying a tape measure and a metal garden trowel. Carla was not home. Vivian stretched the tape along several fence posts, repeating measurements she had already taken many times before. Each time, she concluded the posts were leaning slightly over the line. After several minutes, she tried to pull one of the fence panels loose. The panels were secured with screws and steel brackets. When she tugged on the wood, it barely moved. She tried prying at the base with the garden trowel, but the bracket held firm. Frustrated, Vivian stepped onto a landscaping stone beside the fence and grabbed the top rail with both hands. She began climbing over the fence, intending to reach the other side and inspect the posts directly. The rail sat a little over 6 feet above the ground. As she lifted her right leg across the top, her foot slipped against the smooth wood. Her balance shifted sideways, and she slid forward across the narrow rail. Behind the fence stood a small backyard shed with a metal gutter and downspout beside the fence line. Earlier that afternoon, a ladder used while cleaning the gutter had loosened an exterior electrical line supplying power to the shed, part of an older backyard electrical setup. The cable slipped from its anchor and rested against the metal gutter, energizing it with household current. As Vivian slipped from the fence, she reached out to stop her fall and grabbed the metal gutter, completing the electrical path as her feet landed on damp soil below. The current passed through her arm and across her chest to the ground. Witnesses later reported hearing a brief cry before her body stiffened, her hand clamping against the metal before she collapsed beside the shed wall. A neighbor watering plants in the adjacent yard heard the noise and looked over the fence. Vivian was lying motionless near the shed with one arm still touching the downspout. The neighbor called emergency services. Paramedics arrived within several minutes. Firefighters shut off power at the exterior breaker panel before approaching her. She was unresponsive and not breathing. Resuscitation attempts began immediately and continued while she was transported to a nearby hospital. Despite prolonged efforts, Vivian never regained a heartbeat and was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The medical examiner ruled the death an electrocution after electrical current passed through her chest and disrupted the heart's rhythm. Investigators later confirmed the shed's power line had been knocked loose earlier that day and had rested against the metal gutter, energizing it. It was March 14, 2016, in Clallam County, Washington. The kind of place where the tree line never really ends, and the ground stays damp even in the middle of summer. Most people out there have a quiet appreciation for the land, and honestly, I get it. Maria Fentress had something closer to an obsession. Maria was 41, married, with 2 teenagers still in the house. She worked part-time doing bookkeeping for a local contracting firm. Nothing glamorous, but steady. The job paid the bills. What really occupied her time, though, was everything she'd decided to put into her body and everything she'd decided to keep out of it. Organic produce, homemade everything, zero processed food. That part wasn't unusual for the area. Plenty of people out there live the same way. But Maria had a specific target by late 2015, and that target was tap water. She was convinced, genuinely, deeply convinced, that municipal water was doing more harm than good. Overtreated, chemically loaded, unfit for human consumption. She'd bring it up at neighborhood gatherings, hand out printed articles, work it into conversations that had nothing to do with water in the first place. And look, I'm not here to tell anyone what to drink, but there's a difference between being cautious and being certain. What pushed her over the edge, and I mean that almost literally, was when she started treating her tap water crusade like a public service. She wasn't just changing her own habits anymore. She was on a mission to convert people. Printed handouts at the grocery store, unsolicited water quality, lectures at school pickup. She had a whole binder, an actual binder, with tabs. Sometime in early 2016, she found a spring source about 2 miles out, off a rural access road cutting through a wooded area. Clear water running over rocks, cold, completely undisturbed looking. To Maria, it was exactly what she'd been looking for. She started hauling it back in jugs, first just for herself, then for her family, then for neighbors who were willing to take some. She talked about it the way people talk about a discovery they can't believe the rest of the world hasn't caught up to yet. By February, she had cut out everything else entirely. No tap, no filtered water, no bottled water. Just the spring. She was proud of that fact and made sure people knew it. When a neighbor suggested she get the water tested, Maria cut her off mid-sentence and said that was exactly the kind of fear-based thinking the water treatment industry depended on. And according to her, it was a question of whether people trusted corporations or had any common sense left at all. What nobody knew, including Maria, was that the water wasn't clean. The land surrounding that spring had significant animal activity, and runoff had introduced leptospira bacteria into the source. Leptospirosis isn't something most people can identify on sight because there's nothing to see. The water looks fine. It tastes fine. The infection it causes targets the kidneys and liver, and by the time symptoms show up clearly enough to raise alarms, it's often already progressed further than it should have. That's the part that gets me every time. There's no warning you'd actually notice. The first signs appeared in early March. Fever, body aches, fatigue. Maria told people it was just something going around, which, honestly, makes sense. Those early symptoms don't point anywhere specific. A lot of people would have assumed the same thing and waited it out, but by the second week her skin had yellowed, noticeably. She was exhausted in a way that sleep wasn't fixing. Her lower back had started hurting in a way she couldn't explain away. She showed up to a neighborhood meeting on March 12th, 2 days before she died. People there described her as visibly off, pale, moving slowly, not engaging the way she usually did. Someone asked if she was feeling okay. She said she was fine, a little too sharply, and steered the conversation back to the water, asking if anyone had actually looked at what they were drinking lately, or if they just trusted whatever came out of the tap. She'd brought a jug of it to share. Nobody took any. And I don't know if that detail is sad or just haunting, but it's stuck with me. She collapsed at home on the morning of March 14th. The county medical examiner confirmed leptospirosis, kidney and liver failure, caused by prolonged exposure to the contaminated spring she'd been drinking from exclusively for weeks. The source was tested shortly after and came back positive for the bacteria. It had been there the whole time. Every trip out to that access road, every jug she filled, every neighbor she tried to convince. No third-party fault was found. The spring had no owner. No one had flagged it before Maria started using it, so no warnings had ever been posted. The case was closed quietly. It was March 11th, 2018, at a mid-sized water park in Southern California. A woman had been arguing over a basic safety rule most people followed without thinking. At first, it just slowed things down, but within minutes, it pulled someone else into a situation they had no control over. Linda Foss was 57 years old, visiting the park on a short trip with her husband. They had driven in from out of state, treating it as a simple break without much planning. She worked part-time at a small inn, managing the front desk, handling bookings, payments, and guest check-ins. Routine work she had done long enough to expect things to run a certain way. That afternoon, they headed to one of the park's main attractions, a simulation-style tram ride with continuously moving vehicles that fed into a tunnel of sudden jolts. By the time they reached the loading area, the line had already slowed behind her. Linda stopped at the entrance, arguing about the seatbelt instead of moving with the group. She pointed at it and refused to use it, saying it looked dirty and that she was wearing a white dress. She asked for a clean seatbelt and a different seat. The attendant explained it was required and regularly cleaned, but she kept pushing back, questioning why it even mattered for a short ride. Then, she pointed at one of the seats and refused to sit, saying it wasn't clean enough. Staff repeated that everything was cleared between cycles and that they needed to keep the line moving with the continuous loading system, but she stayed where she was. Behind her, people began to get irritated, shifting in place as the line backed up and the next group waited to board. However, she didn't move. She kept arguing, pointing at the seat, asking for a different one, questioning why she had to use it at all. The line backed up behind her as attendants repeated the same instructions. I've seen this before, when someone stops everything over something small and no one can move until they're done. Even as empty seats passed through the loading belt, she stayed near the edge of the platform, still talking, still holding things up, while staff tried to get her to either board quickly or step fully behind the marked safety line. Because the ride operated on a slow, continuous movement, the vehicles kept passing through at a steady pace. As she continued arguing, she shifted backward without looking, stepping past the painted boundary line that separated guests from the moving track area. There was a narrow, recessed gap beside the platform, normally kept clear when guests stay within the marked loading position, but now exposed because she had moved out of place. Her foot came down into that recessed edge as she turned. She lost her balance instantly. With no stable footing, she fell sideways into the path of the moving tram. The vehicle was already passing through at low speed, but the weight and momentum were enough. Within seconds, the side of the carriage struck her before the operator could fully engage the emergency stop. Everything happened too fast. Staff hit the stop controls immediately, but the movement had already caused severe blunt force injuries. Guests nearby backed away as operators rushed in and called for emergency services. Linda was unresponsive. Paramedics arrived and attempted resuscitation on site before transporting her to a nearby hospital. Despite continued efforts, she was pronounced dead shortly after. Based on the findings, authorities determined that Linda's death resulted from blunt force trauma caused by contact with the moving ride after stepping outside the designated loading position. As for the case, it was reviewed for possible liability and safety concerns. Investigators noted that the ride was operating as designed, with clear floor markings and verbal instructions given. Her movement beyond the safety boundary placed her in an area not intended for guests during operation. In the end, no criminal charges were filed, but the incident was ruled a preventable death tied to unsafe behavior in a restricted zone. The park later reinforced barriers at the loading edge and updated procedures to stop the belt sooner when guests refused to comply. What changed the outcome was the disruption at the loading area. One person stepping out of position at the wrong time in a space where everything else was already in motion. It was June 28, 2014, at a regional water park just outside San Marcos, Texas. A woman had just been turned away from a ride over a rule that wasn't negotiable. At first, it looked like a routine argument, but within minutes, she found another way in. And this time, she didn't go through it alone. One of the visitors that day was Barb Onifer, 61 years old, a retired bookkeeper who had spent years working around routines and structured systems. She was at the park with her daughter and grandson as part of a weekend family outing, something they had planned as a simple way to spend time together. She was used to rules, but also to questioning them when they didn't make sense to her. That afternoon, she got in line for one of the park's enclosed body slides, designed strictly for single riders with a clearly posted weight limit. When she reached the front, the attendant stopped her and explained she exceeded the limit. The rule wasn't flexible, but Barb argued. She questioned how the limit was determined, whether it was being applied fairly, and why others seemed to be allowed through. The exchange went on long enough to draw attention from people nearby. Eventually, the attendant held firm, and she was asked to step aside, but she didn't leave. She stayed near the platform, watching the line. After a shift change, a new attendant took over, someone who hadn't been part of the earlier interaction. As the line moved again, Barb stepped forward without mentioning what had happened before. I'll be honest, this always stands out to me. I've seen people wait for a staff change like it resets everything, like what just happened doesn't count anymore. anymore. This time, she was waved through. At the dispatch point, she was instructed to wait for the signal and go one at a time. But as the previous rider cleared the slide, Barb moved ahead early, entering the launch position before the attendant gave the next dispatch cue. Behind her was another guest, a teenage boy later identified as Rohan Lee, 16, who had been waiting for his turn. From his position, it appeared the cycle had reset, and Barb's movement signaled the next dispatch. As Barb pushed off into the slide without authorization, Rohan followed just seconds after, believing it was his turn before proper spacing had been re-established. Inside the enclosed tube, that spacing mattered. The slide was designed so each rider had enough distance for water flow to regulate speed. With two riders too close together, and with Barb exceeding the intended weight, the balance was disrupted. Barb accelerated faster than expected, while Rohan, entering just behind her, began gaining on her through the turns. People waiting near the exit later said they could hear the difference. Instead of the usual steady rush of water, there were irregular, heavier impacts echoing through the tube, two bodies moving through sections too close together. Inside, neither of them had visibility or control over the distance between them. By the final section, Rohan had nearly closed the gap. Barb exited the slide first, but still carrying more speed than intended. The run-out channel, designed to slow riders gradually, began reducing her speed, but not enough to create safe separation before the next rider arrived. Seconds later, Rohan shot out of the exit behind her. He collided directly into her back at speed. The impact drove both of them forward through the shallow run-out channel and into the end barrier. While the barrier was padded, it was mounted over a rigid support. Barb was forced into it with combined momentum, her body compressed between the structure and the force of Rohan's impact from behind. Lifeguards stationed at the exit reacted immediately. They entered the water within seconds and pulled both riders clear. Barb was unresponsive. Rohan was conscious but disoriented, showing signs of head impact and breathing difficulty. Emergency services were called immediately. On-site medical staff began resuscitation efforts on Barb while stabilizing Rohan. Both were transported to a nearby hospital. Barb Onifer, 61, was pronounced dead shortly after arrival due to severe blunt force trauma to the chest and head, consistent with high-force compression against a fixed structure. Rohan Lee survived with a concussion, rib bruising, and minor fractures. In the investigation that followed, the ride was found to be operating within normal parameters. There were no mechanical failures. The weight limits and rider spacing rules were critical to maintaining safe speeds and preventing collisions inside the slide. It was November 9, 2016, in the downtown protest zone of Oakland, California. The night after a divisive national election, the city was loud and tense. Streets were blocked across several downtown blocks. The crowd was dense and vocal, and the energy had been building since well before dark. By the time dispersal operations began, the atmosphere had shifted from organized demonstration to something harder to manage. Visibility on the street was limited by the crowd itself. Bodies packed close, movement unpredictable in every direction. Officers moved in with a clear directive: clear the area. Joanna Glade was 39 years old. She worked freelance and valued her independence deeply. People who knew her described her as someone who pushed back against authority as a default, not out of anger, but out of a genuine belief that standing down was the same as giving up ground. She attended demonstrations regularly and had a history of confrontations over access in public spaces. That quality can look like courage. On November 9th, it became the thing that killed her. Joanna had asthma, not a mild, occasional kind. Her history included severe exacerbations that had required acute intervention before. She carried an inhaler and knew what her airways could and couldn't handle. She also had a tendency to downplay the condition in high-energy environments where admitting a physical limitation felt like conceding something. That pattern mattered enormously on this night. When dispersal orders went out, the crowd started moving back. Joanna moved toward the front instead. She argued with officers directly, stating she had a right to remain where she was. Multiple orders were issued. Each time she held her position. The crowd around her thinned steadily, people peeling away, creating more and more open space between her and everyone else. She stayed, positioning herself near the edge of a recessed section of the street where airflow was reduced. It was a detail she she almost certainly didn't register, but it meant the gas that reached her would linger rather than clear. Officers deployed tear gas, multiple canisters in rapid succession. The gas spread across the street and reached Joanna where she was standing. Most people cleared the zone quickly. Witnesses confirmed the majority of the remaining crowd moved out within a short window after deployment. Joanna did not leave. She was seen coughing heavily, bending forward and visibly panicking, but still not moving toward the edge of the zone. Her inhaler was on her person. She did not retrieve it as symptoms escalated, whether from the difficulty of the moment, the disorientation of the exposure, or both. She collapsed onto the pavement. The prolonged exposure compounded everything. Her respiratory system was already compromised. The reduced airflow in that section of the street meant the gas sat longer than it would have in the open. Without her medication and without leaving, her airway constriction progressed faster than her body could tolerate. Active dispersal conditions meant responders could not reach her immediately. People returning once the gas dissipated found her unresponsive and called for help, and by then, a significant amount of time had passed. I don't think she believed the night would go the way it did. Most people don't, but the part that's genuinely hard to reconcile is that she knew her lungs. She had been through bad episodes before, and yet holding her ground felt like the priority. The through line of all of it is that she stayed. Every other factor, the gas, the location, the delayed response, only reached her because she didn't leave when leaving was still something she could do. Witness accounts confirmed she had refused to exit despite repeated orders. Medical findings were consistent with status asthmaticus, a prolonged, severe asthma attack that does not respond to normal intervention, triggered by irritant exposure, the absence of timely bronchodilator use, and delayed medical access. Authorities determined her official cause of death as acute severe asthma exacerbation, progressing to status asthmaticus and respiratory failure, precipitated by prolonged tear gas exposure and delayed access to both medication and medical care. Investigators noted directly that her prolonged exposure and failure to exit the area were contributing factors in the outcome. The medication that might have slowed things down was on her when she fell. What wasn't there was the decision to leave. And that decision, or the absence of it, is what the rest of the night turned on. The gap between what she knew about herself and what she chose to do with that knowledge, that's the part that doesn't leave you. It was March 8, 2018, in Portland, Oregon, after nearly a week of nonstop rain had soaked the neighborhood. Water dripped steadily from gutters while portable floodlights illuminated a partially excavated backyard behind a small craftsman-style home where emergency contractors were trying to stabilize a collapsing retaining wall before another storm arrived overnight. After 30 years in permit administration, 67-year-old Beverly Crane didn't just know the rules, she lived by them. And to me, she sounds like the kind of neighbor who treated every trash bin out of place like a personal emergency. She monitored trash pickup schedules, parked cars, fence heights, and renovation permits across the entire block. After her husband died a few years earlier, those habits only became worse. Everyone on the street knew Beverly as the local investigator who reported every minor slip-up, and from what I searched, that focus turned into a total obsession with the couple next door. She was so convinced their art studio was a scam that she spent her days glued to the fence filming workers, as if, to me, she were just one video clip away from finally proving she was right. By early March, nonstop rain had started destabilizing the slope behind both properties. Part of the retaining wall had shifted, forcing emergency contractors to bring in pumps, excavation equipment, and enclosed tarp-covered generators to stabilize the area before the hillside worsened. Multiple warning signs had already been placed around the work zone. Around 6:30 p.m., Beverly walked directly onto the muddy property carrying her phone and a small flashlight. Workers immediately recognized her. One contractor later told investigators everybody groaned the second they saw her coming down the side path because they already knew an argument was about to happen. I could almost feel that collective sigh of the crew. They're dealing with a literal landslide, and now they have to manage Beverly too. Beverly immediately started accusing the crew of performing illegal nighttime construction and damaging shared drainage systems without authorization. The site supervisor repeatedly explained the city had approved the emergency stabilization work that afternoon, but Beverly refused to listen. Instead, she walked around filming workers up close while demanding permits and contractor licenses. And honestly, this is where her ego completely took over the situation. She stopped acting like someone worried about safety and started acting like she needed needed to prove everyone else was incompetent. When a worker warned her to stay away from the enclosed generator area because exhaust could build up under the tarp, Beverly immediately treated the warning like evidence that they were hiding something. Witnesses later said Beverly started accusing the crew of hiding illegal equipment inside the enclosure. The supervisor warned her again that generator exhaust could build up beneath the tarp, but she ignored him, pulled part of it open, and stepped inside while recording on her phone. Workers said she kept yelling accusations at the crew until her behavior suddenly started changing. Her speech became slower, and it's a detail that truly haunts me. She stopped responding clearly to questions. One contractor later said she sounded confused, just repeating the same accusations over and over while leaning against the equipment, which is the exact moment they realized she was losing herself to the carbon monoxide. It's the most terrifying thing about the gas to me. You don't realize anything is wrong until it's already clouded your brain, and all the while, those generators would have sounded completely normal. One worker finally stepped inside the tarp after noticing Beverly had suddenly stopped talking altogether. He found her partially collapsed beside the equipment with her phone still in her hand. Workers immediately dragged her out and called emergency services while attempting CPR in the mud beside the trench pumps. Firefighters arrived within minutes and detected dangerously high carbon monoxide levels still trapped inside the enclosure. The site was cleared of direct wrongdoing because the crew's warnings were caught on tape, but I found that it wasn't a total pass for the company. OSHA still issued a minor citation for missing confined space signage on the tarp, and the city paused the project to update ventilation protocols. The studio was eventually finished. It was a Sunday afternoon in late August 2016. On the outskirts of Reno, Nevada. The sky was clear, the wind conditions were good, and the drop zone was running its regular weekend schedule when Claudia Volser walked in and decided she had a problem with the way things were being run. Claudia Volser was 39 years old and lived in a mid-sized apartment complex in central Reno. She had built a consumer accountability blog alongside her warehouse career, centered on exposing what she called predatory business practices in the Reno area. It had a loyal readership that engaged regularly with her warnings and recommendations. She had posted about the drop zone twice before that Sunday, once questioning its pricing structure and once suggesting its safety protocols were theater designed to justify charging more. She had come to the drop zone that afternoon with a coworker who had a tandem jump booked. Claudia had no booking, no experience, and no prior exposure to skydiving in any formal capacity. She was there as a spectator. That lasted about 20 minutes. What appears to have irritated her first was the length of the pre-jump instruction her coworker was receiving. She watched the lead instructor walk through the safety briefing and equipment orientation and made it known to the people around her that the whole process was being drawn out unnecessarily. When the instructor moved into the equipment demonstration, she approached him directly and told him he was overcomplicating something that was not that complicated. The instructor redirected her and continued. Claudia did not let it go. The argument that followed was witnessed by several people in the staging area, other jumpers, staff members, and a small group of spectators near the hangar. Witnesses described her as escalating steadily, telling the instructor that his job was not as technical as he was making it out to be, and that the entire operation was designed to extract money from people by making them feel like they needed more preparation than they actually did. The instructor eventually walked away from the conversation entirely. That is when Claudia turned her attention to a younger staff member who had been standing nearby. That shift from the person who would not give her what she wanted to the one who might is something I have seen in almost every story on this channel where someone talks their way into something fatal. The lead instructor had held his ground. The younger staff member was newer, less certain, and had just watched a confrontation he was not equipped to navigate. Claudia told him she had completed AFF training at another drop zone. She had not, and that she just needed to be cleared for a solo jump. The staff member, assuming prior certification and failing to verify it through the system, relented. What should have followed was a complete equipment inspection, a solo jump assessment, an altitude and body position briefing, and a review of both primary and reserve deployment procedures. None of that happened. Claudia was issued a parachute rig that had been repacked earlier that week by a junior rigger. The required inspection and sign-off from a certified senior rigger had not yet been completed, a lapse that should have grounded the equipment. Claudia put the rig on with minimal oversight, was cleared through manifest without her credentials being properly verified, boarded the jump aircraft with a group of experienced jumpers, and said nothing to anyone about her actual Experience level. Every checkpoint she skipped was a decision, not an oversight. She exited the aircraft at approximately 10,000 feet. The primary parachute deployed, but entered a line twist configuration that significantly reduced its ability to slow her descent. That kind of malfunction has a practiced response that experienced jumpers train for repeatedly. Claudia had no training. The reserve parachute, her last option, did not deploy correctly, a failure that the subsequent review linked directly to the improper repack. Several people on the ground witnessed the descent and the impact. Staff reached her within moments. There was nothing to be done. The formal review that followed reconstructed the full sequence. The junior staff member who granted her access without verification, the uncertified repack that had never been signed off by a senior rigger, and Claudia's own decision to misrepresent her experience level and walk past every checkpoint the facility had in place. Investigators noted that while multiple failures had contributed, the chain began the moment Claudia lied to someone who was not in a position to push back. She was pronounced dead at the scene from traumatic injuries sustained on impact. The junior staff member faced professional consequences, and the manner of death was ruled accidental. It was March 14, 2016, at a 3-story apartment complex on the west side of Albuquerque, New Mexico. The building had settled into its usual overnight quiet. A few porch lights glowed along the exterior walkway, while most residents had already gone to bed. Directly beneath Unit 3F lived Marlene Koenig, 48. Marlene worked part-time from home as a medical billing coder, reviewing insurance claims on a laptop during late-night shifts. Her schedule rarely matched the rest of the building. She slept through much of the day and stayed awake well past midnight. Most neighbors recognized her not for the job, but for the complaints that often followed. Apartment management records showed she had contacted the city's non-emergency police line more than 90 times over 3 years, usually reporting footsteps, doors closing, or furniture moving in the unit above her ceiling. Property managers kept a thick folder of written complaints she had filed about tenants living upstairs. 5 months earlier, Colton Reyes, 26, a nursing student, had moved into Unit 3F above her. Since then, Marlene had filed 14 separate noise complaints against him. Each time management checked, the activity was described as normal apartment movement, walking across the floor, studying late, or pulling out a chair at a desk. On the night of March 13th, Marlene again called the non-emergency police line, reporting loud pacing above her bedroom. An officer briefly checked the apartment and spoke with Colton Reyes, who had been quietly studying at his kitchen table. Finding nothing unusual, the officer closed the call. Around 1:20 a.m., Marlene called again. Dispatch noted her long history of complaints and advised her to address the issue with property management later. No officer was sent. Frustrated, Marlene left her apartment around 2:10 a.m., wearing a bathrobe and sandals, and climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, knocking sharply on Reyes' door. Reyes opened it briefly. According to his statement, Marlene immediately accused him of stomping deliberately to keep her awake. Reyes explained he had been studying and tried to keep quiet. When the argument continued, he closed the door and returned inside. Marlene remained in the hallway, still speaking loudly. Across the walkway beside the stairwell was a wall-mounted fire extinguisher cabinet, painted red and fitted with a glass panel on the front. The cabinet was mounted roughly at chest height and held a standard 5-pound extinguisher secured by a metal bracket. Witnesses later said Marlene walked directly toward the cabinet and began striking the glass panel repeatedly with the heel of her sandal while leaning her weight into the blows and shouting toward Reyes' door. On the 3rd strike, the tempered glass shattered inward, breaking into small fragments that scattered across the concrete walkway. The extinguisher itself remained secured inside the cabinet. Marlene leaned toward the cabinet opening and reached inside toward the extinguisher bracket. As she stepped closer, the sole of her sandal slid across loose glass fragments scattered across the concrete walkway. Her foot shot forward, throwing her body toward the cabinet. When the glass panel shattered, the thin metal frame surrounding the cabinet had bent outward along the lower edge. As Marlene slipped, her abdomen struck the exposed metal corner with full momentum. The exposed metal corner tore through the fabric of her bathrobe and into the left side of her abdomen. The impact stopped her movement instantly. She collapsed onto the walkway, clutching her stomach as blood spread across the concrete. Residents opened their doors after hearing the crash. One neighbor called for help, while Colton Reyes stepped into the hallway and contacted emergency services. Paramedics arrived within minutes and found Marlene conscious but struggling to breathe with a deep, penetrating abdominal wound. She was transported to a nearby hospital while crews attempted to control the bleeding. Doctors later determined the impact had torn part of her liver and major abdominal vessels, causing rapid internal hemorrhaging. Despite emergency surgery attempts, she died shortly after arrival. The medical examiner ruled the death accidental. It was April 9, 2017, in Gwinnett County, Georgia. A busy stretch of suburban road where the morning commute backed up without fail and pedestrian crossings were more suggestion than structure. The intersection at the center of this story sat between a residential block and a commercial strip, and it moved a steady volume of traffic from the moment the sun came up. Cheryl Cruthers was 54 years old and had lived 2 blocks from that intersection for 11 years. She had retired from a long career in office management and spent most of her time at home, which meant she had more hours in the day than most people to notice things that bothered her. And that intersection bothered her enormously. She had filed complaints with local traffic authorities on multiple occasions about the signal timing, about drivers running the light, about pedestrians nearly getting clipped in the crosswalk. A few of those complaints got acknowledgement letters. None of them got action, at least not fast enough for Cheryl. Her neighbors knew her as someone who cared deeply about the neighborhood and had very little patience for anyone who didn't share that level of care. She was vocal, persistent, and not particularly interested in being told that something was outside her control. When the official channels stopped producing results, Cheryl decided to produce her own. You know what I find fascinating about people like Cheryl? They always think they're the solution to problems that nobody asked them to solve. Sometime in late March 2017, she began stationing herself at the intersection during the morning rush. No vest, no official designation, nothing beyond her own certainty that she knew how traffic should move. She would step into the road to wave pedestrians through, hold up a hand to stop turning vehicles, and position herself in the middle of the crosswalk like she had every authority in the world to be there. She did this every weekday morning for roughly 2 weeks. A few had told her directly that she was going to get herself hurt. Cheryl's response, by multiple accounts, was that somebody had to do it. Can you imagine being so convinced you're right that you'd literally stand in traffic to prove it? By the second week, her presence at the intersection had become predictable enough that some drivers expected her and slowed down accordingly. That predictability, as it turned out, worked against her. On the morning of April 9th, the commute was moving the way it usually did. Steady flow. No major backups yet. Cheryl was in her usual spot near the crosswalk, managing pedestrians the way she had been for days. At approximately 7:40 a.m., she stepped beyond the marked crosswalk and into the outer travel lane to stop a right-turning vehicle, which was something witnesses had seen her do before. What she didn't account for was a second vehicle coming through the intersection from the opposite direction at the same moment. The driver had a green light and no reason to expect a pedestrian in that part of the road. By the time Cheryl moved into that lane, she was less than 2 car lengths away. The driver braked but didn't have enough distance. The impact was at reduced speed but still fatal. Cheryl was dead, struck on her left side, and went down immediately. Several commuters who witnessed the collision pulled over. One stayed with her until emergency personnel arrived. The driver remained at the scene and was visibly shaken. Witnesses were consistent in their accounts. Cheryl had stepped into the path of oncoming traffic while attempting to direct a separate vehicle. Cheryl Cruthers was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as blunt force trauma resulting in internal hemorrhaging, consistent with a vehicle strike at low to moderate speed. The responding authorities reviewed witness statements and traffic camera footage from a nearby commercial property. The footage confirmed what witnesses had already described. The driver was not charged. The investigation closed within weeks, with the determination that Cheryl had placed herself in the path of a vehicle operating lawfully within the intersection. No traffic authority had sanctioned her presence there at any point. Her complaints about the intersection, the ones she had been filing for years, were found on record. The signal timing was reviewed shortly after her death. Adjustments were made the following month. It was February 11th, 2015, inside a casual dining restaurant in Orlando, Florida. Midday service, the kind of shift where the dining room fills up fast and the kitchen runs at a controlled but relentless pace. The dining room was warm, carpeted, and quiet enough for normal conversation. The kitchen was the opposite: hard floors, stainless steel, open flames, and people moving fast. Two completely different environments, separated by a door and a clearly marked boundary. Most people never think about crossing it. Jade Blocks did. Jade was 36 years old. She worked as an office administrator, someone who managed schedules and kept things in order. People who knew her said she didn't accept loose ends. If something was wrong, she wanted it fully addressed. She had a reputation for escalating complaints further than most, not out of cruelty, but from a belief that standards mattered. That mindset had likely served her well professionally. On February 11th, it led her through a door she wasn't supposed to open. The meal hadn't gone as expected. She sent her food back once, then again. Staff responded both times, first the server, then a manager. For most people, that's enough. For Jade, it wasn't. She wanted to speak directly to the cook, not a manager relaying a message, face to face. She said it loudly enough that nearby tables noticed. The manager explained more than once that the kitchen was restricted, off limits to anyone who didn't work there. A divider and posted signage reinforced it. The manager even stood at the entrance. For a moment, it worked. Then, something else demanded attention, a brief shift in focus, and Jade moved past her and into the kitchen. To be fair, she wasn't trying to cause chaos. She thought she was exercising a reasonable right, but the kitchen wasn't a customer service desk. It was a hazard-filled workspace she wasn't trained to navigate. Staff saw her and told her to stop. She didn't. She kept moving, raising her voice, demanding the chef. At the fryer line stood Marco Alvarez, 41, handling multiple orders. He was repositioning a large container of freshly heated oil, turning through a tight lane. Jade stepped directly into that lane, blocking him. The argument became immediate, loud, and close. Marco tried to pivot while holding the container, but Jade shifted with him, staying in front. In that split second, his footing adjusted, his grip shifted, and the container tipped. A huge volume of boiling oil poured out in a continuous sheet. It struck Jade across the chest, neck, and side of her face, soaking her clothing and cascading downward. She recoiled instantly, gasping, trying to wipe and pull the oil away. But it clung, thick, heat-retaining, impossible to brush off. Disoriented and in pain, she stumbled sideways. Instead of moving toward open space, she moved toward the heavy-duty gas range where burners were lit. Still focused on tearing at her clothing, she stepped too close. The oil-soaked fabric reached the flame and ignited on contact. The fire caught low, then spread rapidly across the saturated areas. Staff reacted immediately, shutting off gas, pulling her clear, smothering flames. But the sequence had already escalated beyond recovery. The combination of prolonged contact with high-temperature oil and ignition of saturated clothing caused severe, deep burns across much of her body. She became unresponsive before emergency services arrived. Paramedics transported her in critical condition. Despite intervention, she was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Investigators documented the overturned container, active fryer, open flame range, burn patterns consistent with ignition at the stove line, and restricted access signage. Staff confirmed she had been told to stop and that the incident occurred inside an active cooking zone. Her official cause of death, according to the medical examiner, was extensive full-thickness thermal burns over a large body area, leading to burn shock and rapid cardiovascular collapse. The injuries were not survivable. It was November 14, 2016, near Queens Boulevard in New York City, and cold rain had already turned the evening commute into a disaster. Traffic barely moved, buses were overcrowded from a subway delay, and every time the doors opened, freezing rain blew inside with another group of exhausted passengers. Marlene Voss was 46 years old and worked as a payroll clerk in Midtown, a job that required staring at spreadsheets and enforcing rigid boundaries all day. She rode the same MTA route home almost every evening, and regular commuters already recognized her before the argument even started. That night, the bus was packed shoulder to shoulder by the time it reached Queens Boulevard. Wet jackets rubbed together in the aisle, while several older passengers stood holding support rails because there were no open seats left anywhere, except for the one beside Marlene, where her shopping bag sat instead. And I can already predict the tension on a crowded bus when someone decides their groceries matter more than a neighbor's comfort. comfort. At one point, an older man quietly asked if he could sit down. Marlene pulled the bags closer to herself and said the seat was taken without even looking at him. The man glanced at the empty spot for a second, then awkwardly moved back into the crowded aisle. A few stops later, a construction worker boarded carrying a heavy tool backpack. Witnesses later described him as exhausted and soaked from the rain. After scanning the crowded bus, he politely asked if she could move the bags. But instead of answering normally, Marlene instantly pulled out her phone and shoved it toward his face while loudly accusing him of harassing her. And this part really stood out to me. The guy wasn't yelling, threatening her, or even being rude. He looked exhausted and just wanted somewhere to sit after standing in the rain with a heavy tool bag on his back. But the second nearby passengers started paying attention, Marlene stopped treating it like a normal conversation and started performing the argument instead. The construction worker backed off and raised his hands, but Marlene kept filming, shouting that she was being threatened. By now, the other passengers were losing their patience, seeing elderly riders standing while shopping bags took up a seat. One woman finally told Marlene she was being ridiculous, while another muttered that if she hated people so much, she shouldn't be on the bus. But instead of backing down, Marlene seemed to lean into it, using their anger as fuel to get even louder. Marlene stood up while still recording and started yelling at multiple people at once. Witnesses later said she followed the construction worker farther down the aisle with the phone inches from his face while accusing him of intimidating her. The bus driver finally pulled over near an intersection and opened the front doors. He warned Marlene to either calm down or leave the bus. Instead, she marched toward the front, still filming, and got directly into the face of a man near the door who had called her selfish. She shoved him first, and to me, it's such a senseless escalation. Witnesses later said she kept demanding he repeat what he said while holding the phone inches from him. The man tried stepping away, but Marlene shoved him first. Not hard enough to hurt him, just enough that he instinctively pushed her backward to create space, and that single moment killed her. The front bus steps were already slick from rainwater tracked in by dozens of passengers. When Marlene stumbled backward, the heel of her boot slid against the wet metal edge near the doorway. Her balance disappeared instantly. She fell sideways through the open bus doors and directly into the traffic lane beside the stopped bus. At the same moment, a compact SUV was passing alongside the vehicle. Witnesses later said the driver barely had time to react because Marlene suddenly came out from the blind spot beside the bus. The SUV struck her before braking farther down the street. Paramedics arrived quickly, but the injuries were catastrophic. The autopsy later found multiple rib fractures, severe blunt force trauma to the chest and abdomen, a collapsed lung, and massive internal bleeding. Police later reviewed bus surveillance footage, nearby traffic cameras, and Marlene's own phone, which was still recording near the curb after the crash. The footage showed Marlene shoving the passenger first before he pushed her back to create space. The man was briefly detained, but prosecutors declined to file charges after reviewing the footage and witness statements. Investigators concluded the fatal injuries happened when Marlene slipped on the wet bus steps and fell into traffic. It was a Saturday morning in mid-January 2017. In a quiet residential neighborhood on the western edge of Portland, Oregon. The sky was flat and gray the way it gets in January out there, and the streets were mostly empty by the time Petra Windholm sat down at her kitchen counter and started preparing what she had decided would be the centerpiece of her entire wellness philosophy. Petra Windholm was 36 years old and lived with her husband in a mid-century home she had spent years renovating into what she described on her blog as a chemical-free, intentional living space. She worked occasional shifts at a small, natural food store, but her real investment was the wellness blog she had been running since 2014. It was not large by any measurable standard, but it had a loyal readership, and Petra treated it with the seriousness of a full-time occupation. The blog covered what she called ancestral nutrition, a loose philosophy built around the idea that modern food processing had destroyed the nutritional integrity of everything most people ate. She wrote about sourcing, about organic certification, about the dangers of cooking at high temperatures, and what she believed it did to enzymes and nutrients. Her readers trusted her, and she wrote with the kind of confidence that tends to read as authority even when it is not. By late 2016, she had become particularly focused on raw organ meat. Through forums and self-published wellness literature, rather than any clinical source, she had become convinced that raw beef liver was among the most nutrient-dense foods a person could consume, and that cooking it destroyed the very compounds that made it valuable. She began working toward what she planned to present as her most definitive post yet, a raw liver protocol she had developed herself, intended as proof that everything her critics had been saying about food safety was nothing more than industry-driven fear. Critics had been vocal for months, including one claiming to be a nutritionist, but Petra dismissed them all, calling their concerns overblown and even removing some of the criticism from her blog entirely. That last part is what gets me. She was not just confident, she was actively cutting out the voices telling her to slow down. She sourced what she believed was a premium grass-fed beef liver from a local supplier and stored it in her refrigerator for 2 days before use. Raw beef liver carries a significant salmonella risk that proper cooking eliminates entirely, but that no amount of sourcing quality can guarantee against. Petra knew the concern existed and had addressed it on her blog before, arguing that organic certification made it irrelevant. It did not. On the morning of January 14th, she prepared and consumed a substantial portion of the liver raw. Her husband was home and later recounted that she had been in good spirits, treating the whole thing as a milestone. Symptoms began within 18 hours, nausea first, then cramping, and a steadily climbing fever. Petra attributed it to what she called a detox response and did not seek any help, telling her husband the same thing she had told her readers for years, that the body knew how to handle itself if you gave it the right inputs. By the third day, she could not keep anything down. Her husband brought her in for care on January 17th. The infection had already progressed significantly. Salmonella was confirmed and her condition continued to deteriorate over the following 2 days despite intervention. Petra Windholm died on January 19th, 2017, 5 days after consuming the raw liver. The cause of death was septic shock, resulting from a severe Salmonella enterica infection, confirmed as originating from the raw beef liver she had prepared at home. Her husband had urged her to seek help 2 days before she agreed to, by which point the infection had already advanced beyond what treatment could reverse. The manner of death was ruled accidental, and the case was concluded without further proceedings. It was August 7, 2015, in the parking garage of a busy department store in Sacramento, California. Late-morning shoppers moved between cars and elevator entrances, while vehicles slowly circled the narrow lanes searching for open spaces. Concrete pillars divided rows of tightly spaced stalls along the garage walls. Standing inside one of those empty spaces was Rhonda Pfeiffer, 61. Rhonda had driven to the store with her husband earlier that morning. He had gone inside to return an item while she stayed behind in the garage to wait for him. As the lot filled, Rhonda stepped into an open stall near the wall, intending to hold it so her husband could bring the car around when he returned. She placed her purse on the ground near the back of the stall and stood squarely in the center of the space, clearly claiming it as her own. Other drivers continued moving through the lane searching for parking. Moments later, a compact sedan turned down the row and slowed when the driver spotted the open stall. The driver was Marcus Dalton, 34, who had been circling the garage for several minutes trying to find a spot. As he began turning into the stall, he saw Rhonda standing inside it. Rhonda immediately stepped forward and raised her hand toward the windshield, signaling him to stop. Marcus halted the car halfway into the turn and lowered his window. Rhonda began insisting the space was already taken and pointed toward the entrance ramp, explaining that her husband would be bringing their car down any moment. Marcus told her parking spaces were meant for vehicles, not people. Rhonda refused to move. Instead, she stepped farther into the stall and positioned herself directly between the approaching car and the concrete wall behind her, making it impossible for him to pull fully into the space. The exchange quickly grew louder. Several nearby shoppers paused beside their cars as the confrontation continued through the open window. Marcus again told her to step aside so he could park, but Rhonda remained planted in the stall with her arms folded, refusing to move. After several seconds, Marcus placed the car in drive again. Witnesses later said he appeared to be trying to inch the vehicle forward slightly, hoping the movement would pressure her to step out of the way. The sedan rolled ahead a few inches, but Rhonda refused to move. As he tried to control the brake with his foot hovering between the pedals, the pressure shifted to the accelerator, and the car lunged forward. Rhonda tried to step sideways, but there was little space between the vehicle and the concrete wall behind her. The front bumper struck her legs and forced her backward. A split second later, her body was pinned between the front of the sedan and the concrete wall. Marcus slammed the brake immediately, but the brief burst of acceleration had already pushed the car several feet into the space. Bystanders shouted for him to reverse, and he quickly backed the vehicle away. Rhonda collapsed onto the garage floor beside the wall as people nearby called emergency services. Paramedics arrived within minutes and found her unresponsive with severe injuries to her chest and abdomen. Despite resuscitation efforts, she was pronounced dead at the scene. The county medical examiner later determined that the cause of death was crush injuries to the chest and internal organs sustained when she was pinned between the moving vehicle and the concrete wall. Investigators reviewed garage security footage confirming the argument and the brief acceleration of the car into the space. Authorities determined Marcus had intended only to inch forward to force Rhonda out of the stall, but pressing the wrong pedal caused the vehicle to lunge ahead. The death was ruled accidental, and prosecutors declined to file criminal charges.